Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Brussels Je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we break down the big stories of the week, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, well, it's like deja vu. COVID is back and creeping across the continent at speed. If you haven't had it, you'll probably catch it soon. On top of that, the winter flu, respiratory illnesses, a shortage of doctors, nurses, medicines and an ageing population. Some EU member states facing hospital overcrowding, with patients left on trolleys for days. 3 years since the biggest health pandemic that hit this continent, we're asking if Europe has learnt any lessons and why one of the richest continents in the world cannot take care properly of its sick. And the plot thickens. 2 more MEPs pencilled out by Belgian prosecutors for having alleged links to the corruption scandal that shook the European Parliament before Christmas. MEPs will vote on whether or not to lift their immunity next week for them to be interrogated, as the Belgian authorities keep connecting the dots of this case, which led to them finding €1.5 million in cash. We're asking if this could be the end of the culture of impunity within the European Parliament and what measures will come into force to improve transparency urgently within the political corridors of Brussels and Strasbourg. To talk about these stories and much, much more, I'm joined here in our studio by the German Green MEP, Daniel Freund.
Hi. By
the Croatian MEP, Tomislav Sokol from the European People's Party.
Hi.
And Rebecca Christie, analyst with Reuters. Thank you so much for being with us. And before we hear from you, let's just first take you to Saint-Pierre Public Hospital. It's here in Brussels to hear how they've been coping with the spike in COVID cases after the Christmas party season. Paul Larocque-Hoppeno and Christopher Pitchers have more.
When the pandemic first hit in 2020, CHU Saint-Pierre here in Brussels was the first public hospital to receive COVID patients in the whole country. It specialises in respiratory diseases and, like most places, saw some tough times throughout the health crisis. But with a fresh wave of cases now hitting Europe, how is it coping? The hospital's Director General says just fine.
The situation is generally under control. So we have a few COVID cases every week or even every day, but very few of them needs for the patient to stay a few nights in the hospital. So it's nothing to compare to what we had to face in COVID wave 1 and 2.
Things are expected to get worse over the next few weeks, though, as infections pile up after Christmas and New Year. With many of Europe's hospitals still not fit for purpose, the Director General says more money is needed to get them up to scratch.
The problem that the COVID crisis revealed is the underlying financing of the healthcare system in Europe and different situations in different countries, obviously, but I think a trend is that we have healthcare systems and financing built in the 80s or in the 90s.
For now, healthcare workers will just be looking to make it through the winter more easily than the past few. But the question of European healthcare systems preparedness looms large over it all.
So one hospital there seems to be coping for now, but the big question, of course, as I said, why are our healthcare systems not fit for purpose and what have we learned from the pandemic? Mr. Sokol, I would like to start with you because you're, of course, on the special committee over at the European Parliament. It's called COVID-19 Lessons Learned and Preparedness for the Future.
Yes.
Are we really prepared for the future?
We are much more prepared than we were in 2020. That's definitely. And if one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that problems like this cannot be resolved by individual member states alone. So definitely now we have much stronger European institutions. We have protocols how to deal with situations when we have viruses crossing the border, and I think the situation is much better than it was before, and we are much better prepared. We have the ways how to deal with situations, how to stockpile necessary equipment and things like that.
Okay, let's just bring in Daniel Freund. Get your take on this. Is this a big concern for you right now, for your group?
I think it continues to be a concern, but the situation is obviously very different than at the height of the pandemic, where hundreds, thousands of people were dying every day. So this is still something to be managed. And I think particularly mid and long term, to assure that we have the necessary staff in our hospital, that these are jobs that are well paid, and that people want to do these, so that we have enough people taking care of the sick, of the elderly that suffer particularly from COVID.
And Rebecca Christie, just a reaction from you. I saw health ministers, or there were talks at European level there recently. Are the European heads of state, are they in crisis mode regarding COVID, do you think?
There's a general sense of urgency around making sure that salaries for healthcare workers are paid attention to, because across Europe we see that workers are not necessarily seeing their wages keep pace with inflation and cost of living. If you don't have the workers, you can't have the healthcare. You also have less of a COVID spike, but you have more of other respiratory diseases, and particularly for children who in Europe are largely not vaccinated. This means that even if they recover, you have more of a strain on the healthcare system than you might.
Absolutely. And that's also the take of the WHO. We actually caught up with Dr. Catherine Smallwood, and she's been warning about this inevitable winter situation since last summer, but she's not panicking yet. But take a listen.
We're in a much better place. However, the virus is continuing to circulate at high levels and continuing to cause too many people to die. We also see in the virus a continued ability to evade our immune systems, to continue to evolve. And so we have to keep very, very strong attention on what is happening with the virus. Because of the lifting of all of the big measures that had really kept these other viruses at bay, we're seeing that those other viruses are coming back with a little bit of a vengeance. And it's the combined impact of the high level of SARS-CoV-2 transmission, the high level of influenza transmission, and the high level of RSV and other respiratory viruses that are cumulatively combining to put pressures on our hospitals.
So Dr. Catherine Smallwood there speaking to our Paul Larocque. Hoppin, a reaction to that, Mr. Sokol?
Yeah, I think the main difference is that the new variants of COVID are much less severe in terms of consequences, in terms of people having to go to respirators or dying from it, but they are more contagious than the previous versions. So now we have still many cases, but the pressure on the healthcare system is not as strong as it was before, and this is why we are able to manage. I think that's the most important situation. But I wanted to comment on what was said about financing, about healthcare workforce problems. So it's not the same across the European Union. Us in Eastern Europe have a bigger problem because a lot of our healthcare professionals emigrate because of better working conditions, higher salaries to the West, and this is something that also EU needs to manage. Of course, the problem is that financing and organization of healthcare is a national competence. So each individual member state has to define its own healthcare policy, how it organizes its system. But still, I think EU has a lot of financial possibilities to recovery and resilience plans and cohesion policy to actually help member states better cope with this and to provide additional funding for healthcare. And this is something that we have to focus on, especially on workforce, because if our nurses and doctors emigrate to the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, etc., then the problems and this gap that exists between less developed and more developed regions will just become bigger.
And indeed, I have some figures here. In Germany, reports that by 2035, more than a third of jobs in healthcare won't be filled. In Finland, 200,000 new healthcare workers will be needed by 2030. I mean, how do you fill these gaps?
Well, I think one answer is education. Train more people to do those jobs. And another answer is immigration. Is people that can do these jobs and that come to our part of the world and do the job. We need a more modern immigration policy for the Union to answer some of those questions. We have aging populations here, and we're running into that trouble.
So although it feels a little bit like a movie, a bit like deja vu with COVID over the last couple of weeks and people wearing masks again and cancelling their plans, I guess stepping back, the bigger health challenges are, of course, the fact that doctors are migrating. If you look at Ireland, for example, they're bringing in a lot more foreign trained staff. Also, Greece has been urging for cross-border cooperation to prevent medicine shortages. Also, France's health care system seriously under pressure. And also the WHO called it a ticking time bomb, in fact, saying that healthcare was under threat all across Western Europe, and German hospitals on the brink due to a rise in viral infections. Rebecca Christie, you've been covering the EU for over a decade now. I mean, as Mr. Sokol pointed out, this is all obviously national member states' competences. So is there a European solution to all these problems that seem so similar across all the EU member states?
The EU has shown it can work together on vaccine development when there's a priority to do that. It would be great if this enthusiasm for vaccines to limit the severity of disease could extend to things like RSV, to things that we have vaccines for, like the flu, like varicella. There just isn't the sense right now that childhood illness is something that can be minimized for the safety of the whole population.
Mr. Sacco, your take on that?
Yes, I agree with completely. But what is also important is that there are some areas where we have even bigger problems, where we just there are not enough incentives to develop new medicines, like antibiotics, for instance. And that's also one of the problems that we are facing today. So apart from providing financial help to the member states to better cope with the situation and trying to fill these gaps, the controlled migration, not uncontrolled migration, but controlled migration of people that are really needed for the EU. But we also need to provide a better framework also to stimulate research and innovation in Europe, because now we see that most of the research innovation goes to the US and China. We are losing our competitiveness, and if we continue to act like that, then Europe will just lag behind more against other parts of the world.
Sounds like we're shooting ourselves in the foot there.
Well, one thing that I have to say that frustrates me is sometimes a lack of a European approach to. I'm not saying all health issues need to be taken care of from Brussels, but certain things need to be solved here. It makes no sense that if someone flies from China to Italy, and it makes a difference what health rules apply, whether they travel through Frankfurt or Paris. So on these kind of things, we need a common European approach. And I think it also makes no sense if, for example, on a general shortage of medical staff, that we're trying to steal them from each other in a way and take more of a European approach to that would certainly help.
And on that shortage of doctors, one man who has been trying to help out and fill that gap is one of your counterparts, a member of the European Parliament from Germany, Peter Liese. I'm sure you know Peter Liese. He's a German MEP. So he showed up on his Twitter profile this week, stepping out in his full gear, saying he spent part of his Christmas holidays stepping in as a doctor, volunteering, saying the situation was so grave. There's a lack of medicines was leading to catastrophic consequences in this hospital. The children were being hospitalised for many, many nights just because these medicines were not available. So what is the solution to this? How can we get these medicines available for these children?
We're seeing a combination of supply chain problems, budgeting problems, and just-in-time inventory on the finance and on the physical goods side. If you're running close to what you need day to day, you don't have a lot of reserve. Given all of the emphasis on fiscal, moderate spending, managing your budget, if you are specifically trying to limit the amount of excess in the system, then you just don't have a lot of flexibility if the plane doesn't show up.
So what do you tell to our viewers who are sitting at home? They've been waiting. They've got loved ones who are sitting on trolleys, for example, in some countries, waiting to be seen, elderly. They've also been waiting for operations, for treatments, for scans.
But when you speak of healthcare budgets, it is true that the European approach in their last crisis, the financial crisis, was austerity. So limit the budgets, limit spending, and healthcare was one of the biggest victims there, because healthcare is primarily funded from public sources. Now this has changed. The narrative has changed. The EU has shown us that healthcare should be an objective in itself, not just a way how to cut spending and control budgets. And this is something which I think is very good. And actually the whole paradigm here in Brussels has changed, and healthcare has become from a very marginal topic. Traditionally has become much more important than it was before, but we now have to seize the momentum and really try to make this work and try to create stronger European health policy and to provide stronger also financial, but not just financial, but other types of help to those member states who need it the most.
And is the future of healthcare digital? As we heard from that doctor earlier that my colleague met here in the hospital, he said our healthcare systems in Europe, they date back to the 80s, and now we're in 2023.
Well, digitalization certainly has to play a role, but supply chain issues, if we can't get the medication, that we're not solving with a computer. Budget plays a role, but I think we also have to reflect whether, most of our medicines should exclusively come from China, for example, or whether we want to relocate some of that production to Europe to ensure that when we do need fever medicine or others, that some of that can be sourced locally as well.
And this week we had a reporter, Euronews reporter in the south of Italy, meeting some 51 doctors that came over from Cuba. They'll be helping the critical situation in Italy now. You can take a look. They're coming up on the screen there. They look very eager. Is this the way to go, Mr. Tomasako?
I mean, that's one possible measure to extinguish the fire, but that it's not a long-term solution. So in Europe, we definitely have to provide, as I said, additional funding, stronger investments into infrastructure, into workforce. But also, what is important is if we regulate too much, if we create too much administrative burdens, also then it will be really hard to get this production and supply chains back to Europe. So if we want to to stimulate investments in Europe, this needs to be private investment. And if we want private investment, then we have to create a framework which provides incentives for private investment, and not to impose additional burdens, additional obstacles, additional regulation, because Europe is much more regulated than the US. We all know that. And because of this reason, then we have this shift of production there. So if we want to preserve, to have some production and supply chains return to Europe, we cannot do this by decree, but we have to create a framework where investments would be stimulated, where investments would be, in the end, I don't know that it's a dirty word for some, but this is word that we cannot do without, that they can also make a profit out of that.
Reaction, Daniel Freund?
Yeah, no, I agree. Price is one measure, but also the way that we currently tender things. You know, in Germany, the government that the Greens are part of right now have introduced that price is now no longer just the only criteria when you do procurement for medicine, for example, but that there should always be one offer that either comes from Germany or from Europe to make sure that it's not just Chinese or Indian or whatever production that wins in those tendering procedures.
Well, just on that point as well of procurement, while Europe is grappling with all these pandemics and crises, the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has also been summoned or asked to speak in front of that special committee, the COVID-19 European Parliament Committee, about her role negotiating the multi-billion-dollar contract that she had with Pfizer. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen boasts that the European Union was the pharmacy of the world during COVID, but at the same time, there's questions, isn't there, Mr. Sokol, around how that was negotiated. Will she be going to that hearing, and how will it go?
Yes, we will see what will happen. I think in general we shouldn't forget that the whole joint procurement of vaccines was a big success. So we were able to get it really pretty fast, taking into account all the problems with the supply chains and production. But what is even more important, that all the member states got it more or less at the same time. So those member states without member states without production like Croatia were able to get the vaccines more or less at the same time, like countries which produce medicines like vaccines like Belgium, Germany, etc. And on the hearing, we see definitely, I think there is room for improvement in terms of the transparency of the whole system, and I think that we will learn some lessons from what happened before. But I think that we should not forget that the overall process and the overall result was really a big success.
And just very briefly, what's your take on that hearing? Will this be very damaging for Ursula von der Leyen?
Hearing or not, I think what needs to happen is these are some of the most expensive contracts that the EU has ever entered into, billions of taxpayer money. We need to know how this went and if everything went well. I agree that the vaccine campaign in Europe was generally a success, but if some of this was negotiated over text message, well, then those text messages need to be accessible the same way that an email, a letter, or any other form of communication would be transparent. And it's a bit a shame that, particularly for Ursula von der Leyen, that had been in trouble in Germany before for not releasing text messages, and now a couple of years later, we're back exactly at the same thing here now at the European level. So if all is well, and as you say, successful vaccine campaign, then please let us have a look at how the negotiations of those contracts went, and that hopefully we didn't way overpay for what we got in the end.
Rebecca?
The holy trinity of public procurement is you can have something fast, you can have something good, and you can have something cheap. Generally, you have to pick two. Europe is going to have to look at its choices and see what it wants to do differently next time.
Absolutely. Rebecca, I wanted to also ask you about the impact the COVID crisis and the sicknesses are having on the European economy with all this sick leave. I took a look at the figures of Eurostat, and it says sickness is costing the EU up to 1.1 billion euros per year. And one Dutch insurance company saying last year the Dutch economy was hit by 18 billion euros due to long periods of absenteeism.
Sick leave is something that, to me, is one of Europe's triumphs. In the United States, where there isn't paid sick leave by and large, people either run into severe economic difficulties or they go to work sick and they spread the disease to lots of people. So if you're paying people to take care of themselves when you're sick, yes, it's expensive, but the alternatives are not very good.
Going to have to stop you there, because that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for on that topic. But don't go anywhere, because one story that just keeps giving is the corruption scandal that rocked the European Parliament before Christmas. We'll have an update for you after the break. See you soon on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look back at some of the big European stories of the week. Well, still dominating the headlines here, the corruption scandal that shook the European Parliament recently. MEPs will vote next week on whether or not they should lift the immunity of 2 more MEPs so that they can be investigated by the police, Belgian socialist Mark Tarabella and the Italian socialist Andrea Cosolino. So my first question, especially to the members of the Parliament around the table, do you know those 2 MEPs, and will you be voting next week to make sure their immunity is lifted or not?
Yes, I think the overwhelming majority will vote in favor of lifting the immunity. I think it's a typical procedure. This is not the first time that we are lifting some MEPs' immunity, so this is more or less standard. So definitely, yes, I will be voting in favor of it. We want this to be investigated, especially since this has created great damage to the reputation of the European Parliament.
Absolutely, not just the European Parliament, the whole EU. Daniel Freund, what about you? Do you know the 2 gentlemen, and what will you be voting next week?
No, not very well. I've seen Tarabella around, but I know no close working relationship with those 2. And indeed, it will be standard procedure to lift the immunity. Just to say that this immunity protection is to protect us as members from political attacks, so that no one tries to prosecute us for something that we might have said in plenary, for example. So whenever there comes a request that is a criminal investigation, a traffic violation or whatever, it's routinely lifted so that the authorities can do their job. They can investigate and then find out whether they have committed a crime or not.
But how does this make you feel when you become an MEP and you sign your contract having this immunity? Does it make you feel very privileged, very powerful and untouchable?
No, definitely not. I was also a member of the national parliament in my country, so it's pretty similar. So the whole idea of immunity, it has the historical background, as the colleague said, was to protect the MPs from political pressure. 200 or 300 years from the king or whoever, but now also from other groups who can exert political pressure. So it's really a standard procedure, typical procedure, routine procedure that this is lifted in case of criminal investigations. It will be the same now.
And it's worth pointing out that those 2 MEPs have said they're innocent, and they can be heard as well in the European Parliament to give their evidence. Now, what we were also looking at this week in Brussels, Rebecca Christie, was this 14-point plan that came out. It's Roberta Metsola, the European Parliament President. It's her plan to try and tackle this corruption, clean up the European Parliament. Do you think it will work?
It's a good plan. It's a good way to get started, to resolve to do better, to be more transparent about who people are meeting with, why and when, and what kind of outside contracts they have. The European Parliament is at a crossroads right now. It's trying to grow up as a legislative body and as a lawmaking force in the EU, as opposed to just somebody that has discussions and provides a voice of democracy. They're trying to be an arm of democracy. That also means growing up in terms of accountability. You can't just take a side job. You need to be clear about what, why, and who's paying for it.
So the European Parliament is trying to grow up. Rebecca Christie suggesting that the members of the Parliament are all toddlers, perhaps, and misbehaving constantly. Daniel Freund?
There is an issue with the behavior of certain members. We're seeing that with this scandal, but this is not the first time that we've seen things go wrong in the Parliament, people breaking the rules. And I have to say that, if you look at the last 10 years, there have been numerous members that have broken the rules, and so far there was a bit of a culture that nothing then happens. No one ever gets punished for not publishing that they have been invited on luxury trips, when they don't publish their side incomes. That is something that really needs to change. We have a lot of...
You feel untouchable. This goes back to my point.
Well, I don't, but apparently some of the colleagues do. And there is a problem with the self-policing, if you want, that MEPs control each other's, the commissioners control each other, but we need independent checks on that the rules are respected. And the other thing is, we have lots of good rules on lobby transparency, for example. If you compare us with what is going on in most member states and the national capitals, we're far ahead, particularly in the European Parliament. Any word I ever say in plenary, every vote I take, every meeting I take with a lobbyist, you can find all that online. But it isn't really checked. It's not sanctioned when colleagues don't do that, and not everyone follows the rules. Not everyone is as transparent as they should be.
I'd like to say that it's not that the Parliament is misbehaving or acting like small children. It's more that the Parliament hasn't historically always had that much influence in policy making. What with the changes in the treaty, what with the changes in the role of the Parliament has more influence. And when you have more influence, it matters more. And that's why people are checking more now.
And Mr. Sokol, for this 14-point plan to bite, for it to have any sort of power, it will of course have to have the approval of MEPs.
Yes, I think it's a good plan. Some things can be improved. I think in general it's a good plan. I think one of the main issues is the work, which needs to be much better regulated, much more transparent, of the NGOs, who are really not NGOs, but lobbyist groups paid in many cases by third countries. Also friendship groups. So all of these possibilities where MEPs interact with third parties, which are in many cases just funded from countries outside the European Union, who use this to exert their political influence. So I think that if we are meeting NGOs, we at least, and if these NGOs are entered into transparency register, we should at least know who is funding them. I think and I think if we are able to do that we have a clear picture of who is funding these kinds of NGOs who are lobbying within the European Parliament, then we'll get a much better picture of actually who is trying to influence European Parliament from outside.
I have to say, I mean, this general bashing of NGOs is really not the lesson we should draw from what has happened here. Yes, former MEPs have used a certain legal structure to apparently launder money to pay out bribes, but whether they do that through a company structure, an NGO structure, or whatever legal vehicle, the problem is not sort of the legal vehicle, and particularly now making a general accusation that there's a problem with NGO transparency. I mean, NGOs have to sign up to the register. They do publish who funds them. It's just that here they didn't sign up to the register, and apparently none of the institutions ever bothered to check. Lots of MEPs, former commissioners, whatever, sat on the board. No one bothered to check whether they had actually signed up to the register. That's the problem, and not just throwing NGOs generally.
This is not NGO bashing, but if you have formal lobbyist groups, interest groups, companies, associations of companies, then at the outset you know who you're dealing with. But you have NGOs who are there to protect human rights, but essentially what they are doing is lobbying for some countries' geopolitical, economic interests, then definitely that is a much greater issue, and this is something that needs to be regulated. But I agree, and the rules need to be implemented much better than they are implemented now. In that sense, I also agree with the colleague. We need better rules, but also better implementation.
Better rules and better implementation. Okay, well, we'll see what comes of that statement, Roberta Metsolas' 14-point plan. And one party as well coming out really bad this week is, of course, the Socialist Party. They put out their own plan as well to clean up corruption among their members. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to you all for your insights. And thank you for watching. Stay with us here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look back at some of the European stories that caught our eye this week. Now, one that we wanted to share with you is the findings of a brand new Barometer survey that shows the top 3 worries of Europeans across the continent. Over 26,000 people in 27 EU countries were quizzed, and it turns out that 9 in 10 people are worried about, first, the cost of living crisis, spiralling food and energy prices, then poverty, and then climate change.
Those are the things that keep us up at night. I mean, poverty, no one likes that. If you're in poverty, that's bad. If you're not in poverty, you're afraid you're going to be in poverty. And if you're not afraid of that immediately, you're not happy with its effect around you. Climate change is the medium to long-term problem, and it all costs money.
And that's not even to mention the health crisis that we discussed earlier. Daniel Freund, did you see that? Does that relate to you and your voters?
It's what I hear from the citizens that I interact with on a daily basis as well. I hope that at least over the medium term, particularly the rising cost of living is something that we get under control. We see some good signs from the energy markets these days. Gas prices are still incredibly high, but they're slowly going down. What we have to deliver, and where Europe can be a big support, is of course to really speed up, to boost the construction of renewable energy, because we're seeing, no one beats solar energy, wind power. This is the cheap energy we have to get to the European economy.
And Mr. Sokol, what about Croatians? I mean, you've just entered the Eurozone. It's obviously a good news story, good for tourism, but also will there be pain as well for locals?
Yeah, I mean, cost of living, that's the major issue. There were some increases in prices. Some of the traders try to take advantage of the introduction of euro, but I think we will be able to tackle that. But generally, yes, I mean, the cost of living, energy sufficiency, these are also short-term but also long-term major issues in the European Union. We made a lot of mistakes in terms of our energy policy, like, for instance, shutting down nuclear power in Germany and substituting this nuclear power with more Russian gas. And now these mistakes that we made in the past, or some member states made in the past, are coming to haunt us. So I hope that we will learn some lessons. I thought that we'll invest more into alternative supplies of energy, also more into nuclear energy as well, not to be ideological, but more science-based than we were before.
Sounds to me a weird economic policy to invest in what seems, well, other than gas and coal at the moment, just the most expensive energy. If you look at any of the projects being built, they're way over time, they're way over cost. We need cheap energy and reliable energy that can be built fast, and that is renewable energy right now.
But we also did stable sources of energy, which will not go down if there is no sun and if there is no wind, and we have this stable supply of energy and long-term supply of energy. Then we definitely need nuclear energy as part of the energy mix.
I'm just going to stop you there because I do want to show you the other piece of information that we found quite astounding from that Barometer, which showed that EU countries, people are struggling to pay their bills at the end of the month. Which EU countries? If you look at Greece, Portugal and Bulgaria, the situation seems dire. And in Netherlands, Denmark and Sweden, the situation seems fine. Rebecca, it feels like we're back at the Eurozone debt crisis a decade ago. Has nothing changed?
Greece and Portugal had to take big hits to their wages, to their pension systems, to a lot of their long-term financial planning when they were getting out of the crisis. Bulgaria, as we know, has had weak economic growth for a long time, and that's a constant challenge there. Inequality, we know, is rising. People in the asset economy who've had assets that increased in value are much better prepared now for this downturn and possible recession than people who've been living day to day.
So what message of hope, perhaps, do we have to leave our viewers as we conclude this edition of Brussels, My Love? Daniel Freund?
Well, I think that the answer to this crisis that we all face together at the end is Europe, and we're all going to be better prepared and better able to answer this crisis if we do it together.
Two tiny reactions.
Yes, also, I think we need common, stronger European policies. We need to provide additional sources of energy to try to reduce costs, but also have stable supply. And we also have to regulate the market much better than it was today, so that we don't have somebody taking advantage of the situation.
Okay. Tomislav Sokol, Croatian MEP, thank you so much. Daniel Freund and Rebecca Christie. Lovely to have you all here, and we'll see you soon on Euronews and Euronews.com.